Welcome to Part B. Shin Nihan Kiku, or SNK for short, started way back in 1979 by Akichi Kawasaki after seeing the success of Taito and Namco and wanting a piece of the action for himself. Their first game that they released was Osmar Wars, which was a clone of Space Invaders but is perhaps notable as being the first shooter to have a health bar instead of a one hit and you die. They also did the totally bizarre arcade game called Safari Rally, and of course the revolutionary horizontal shooter Vanguard. SNK would continue releasing games throughout the 80s, but there was nothing really to wow the gamers. And it wasn't until 1989 when they would really hit their stride. For in 1989 they released the SNK Multi-Video System, or MVS, which allowed arcade owners to have up to 6 games placed in one cabinet, and then they were able to swap those games as easily as swapping a console cartridge. This money-saving system that would save arcade owners both space and money went down really well, especially in the tougher arcade world where interest had fallen due to the more powerful home arcade game ports. Initial games released for the new hardware was Magician Lord, a highly polished run and jump platformer. Then there was NAM 1975, which was a great tough shooter. And finally, Baseball Stars Professional, which was a gorgeous-looking baseball game. The following year, in 1990, SNK would take the hardware of their arcades and release a home console called the Neo Geo Arcade Entertainment System, or Neo Geo AES for short. The name Neo Geo tried to capture the philosophy of the company, with it being Latin for New Frontiers. The console initially cost a whopping $699 or £440, and despite it dropping in price, the machine would only be for the very rich, with individual games costing over $200 or £130 each. This cost was due in the main to the large memory needed to store the games. Prices which were fine for an arcade owners, but home owners that was a little bit beyond most people's budget. The machine would carry on for many years, having niche appeal, with SNK eventually releasing the Neo Geo CD machine in 1994. This made the games pretty much normal prices to buy, but the payoff was that you would have to watch a juggling monkey for about 15 minutes as the game loaded. But enough about SNK and its machines. Let's rewind back to 1991 and the great games that SNK released. Firstly, imagine if you will the friction between Capcom and Takashi Nishiyama and Hiroshi Matsumoto, who had developed the original Street Fighter game. They felt understandably frustrated and sidelined by Capcom as they saw their game be passed on to another developer. These two employees would leave Capcom and join SNK to show how they would have done their beat-em-up sequel. The game that they released was called Fatal Fury, King of Fighters, introducing the fighters Terry Bogard and Andy Bogard as they enter the King of Fighters tournament. And although seen by many as perhaps more simple than Street Fighter 2, it still held its own and even added such innovations as the ability to jump depth-wise, allowing another dimension to the fighting. A stack of sequels would follow for the game, further honing the gameplay with each iteration. In tandem to this game being released in 1992, there was another beat-em-up released called Art of Fighting. This had a clever zoom function to the game that actually showed your players' damage as they fought. A further 2 sequels of this would follow in 1994 and 1996, refining the gameplay further. But it would be in 1994 that SNK's most famous fighter series would be released, taking the best fighters of Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting, with the release of King of Fighters 94. This took all that was great about the other games and improved upon them. The King of Fighters game would enjoy yearly updates, each time adding to the player roster and tweaking the gameplay mechanics to absolute perfection, and so starting a fierce rivalry between the gamers on whether Street Fighter or King of Fighters was best. Other great games released by SNK was King of Monsters in 1991, that had you play Godzilla-sized monsters monsters as you fought each other across a cityscape, causing the city to fall to ruin as you fought. A sequel was released in 1992, which also continued the mayhem. There was also Samurai Showdown, released in 1993, which actually brought weapons to the beat-em-up party. Then there was World Heroes in 1992, released by Alpha Dentsu for SNK. In this, you got to play the world's greatest warriors of history, like people like Genghis Khan, and so you could see who would win. Other games that are notable was Last Blade, released in 1997, and the phenomenally good Galao Mark of the Wolves, released in 1999. SNK may be known for their beat-em-ups, but of course they would also be known for other games as well. In 1992, Viewpoint was released by ACOM, a brilliant isometric blaster with the fantastic James Brown-inspired soundtrack and the unrelentless and unforgiving gameplay. Then in 1996, Nazca and SNK would release Metal Slug, which was a top-class run-and-gun blaster with great humour and animation. Sequels would quickly follow from Metal Slug 2, released in 1998, all the way through to 7 or Metal Slug XX. But of course, although SNK may have been rivals to Capcom in the elite gamer circles, it was another game really that was a real contender to the Street Fighter crown. And that, of course, was Midway's Mortal Kombat. Released in 1992 for Midway by two veteran Williams developers, Ed Boon and Mark Turnell, who, incidentally, did Smash TV, Total Carnage and NBA Jam. They used their knowledge of doing digitised game sprites, used in such games as Narc and the shooter Terminator 2, and so they did Street Fighter but with real actors to do the sprites. Originally they hoped to get Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal to star in the game, but when that didn't pan out, they instead turned to unknown actors. They also added blood and brutal fatality moves, causing quite a gore fest and also a media fury on its release. There were 7 combatants in the game, from Johnny Cage, Raiden, Sonya, Liu Kang, Shang Tsung, and the ninjas Sub-Zero, Scorpion, and the rarely seen Reptile. Oh, and also there was the boss, the stop-motion monster, Goro. A number of Mortal Kombat films have been released since, and even a TV show has come out based on these games. Then in 1993 they released Mortal Kombat 2, adding even more characters to the mix and better graphics. They carried it on in 1995 with Mortal Kombat 3, even doing an extended version of the game called Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which had even more players. Finally, in the arcades, they did Mortal Kombat 4, released in 1997, and since then they've gone through literally dozen of iterations released on the consoles, with the latest being Mortal Kombat vs DC, which tries to do the Capcom versus games, but this time instead of against Spider-Man, you're against the DC comic universe, so people like Batman and Superman. This game was released in 2008. Midway would continue using their digital technology with Judge Dredd in 1993 in the arcades. Then in 1994, Midway-owned Atari Games would release another digitized brawler called Primal Rage. This time it had you fight each other with dinosaurs, and is consequently great fun. If all that wasn't enough for you, also in 1994, Rare Games would release through Midway their own digitised beat-em-up called Killer Instinct. It had you fight with a suitable range of madcap warriors, and even letting you play the werewolf Saberwolf from the old Ultimate Play the Game classic that they'd released all those years before on the Spectrum. The game was even successful enough to have a sequel in 1996, which extended both the graphics and the player roster. They also released Rampage World Tour, which was an update to the Rampage game in 1997, but to be honest, by the mid-1990s, Midway would begin to leave the arcades for good, only really doing the Cruising series, released in 1994, and, of course, after buying Atari, they released the disappointing Gauntlet Legends, released in 1999. That's the end of Part B, please go on to Part C.